Yeah.
All right, excellent. So this is session 5. It is Tuesday, May 3rd, 2022. Today we are going to cover scope, and then we are going to get into some challenges. Some of you may or may not have already bumped into this and error messages. I think, Steve, maybe this is something that had to do with what we talked about on Monday night at the end of class. But basically, scope in JavaScript refers to where variables and functions are accessible in your code. Global scope is basically any variable declared outside of a function is going to be in the global scope. You can access these variables anywhere in the program. Local scope is anything defined inside a function and is only accessible to that function in any functions or blocks of codes inside of it. So global scope is, again, just variables at the very top line, right? So if I say let name equal Charles, make that a string, and we do console.log name, right? And we run this, and there's that. And let's go ahead and we'll just do this as global name. Right, and same thing. So next, if we do a function, so we say function name game name, and then we return, or let's do let local name equal nugget. It was a little monster that was just sitting on my lap, and we can do console.log local name. And then if we come down here and we instantiate, or I'm sorry, we call or we invoke our function, right? No. Technically don't need this here. We don't need a parameter for this. And we call it, right? There's nugget. So now I can also come in here and say, hey, let's look at global name, right? And so if I block, or if I comment this out up here, right? So there's nugget, local name, and there's Charles, global name, right? And so now this local name is local to this method only. So if I come down here and say console.log local name, right? So I'm already getting like a gray underline under here, and so could not find name local name. Did you mean global name? So it's giving me a suggestion saying, hey, I can see this, but I don't know what you're talking about right here, right? So reference error, local name is not defined. Well, it's defined up here, but it is a local variable that is only available in the scope of this function, right? And global variables are like they're everywhere. So I could keep writing different functions. The problem with global variables, and you always want to minimize the amount of global variables that you have, is because I could write 7 different functions and all 7 of them could have access to global variable. All 7 of them could reassign them. All 7 of them could mutate it and change the value that it is. And you don't know what was necessarily responsible for doing that. And so by keeping variables as local variables, you control how much of the program has access to that piece of information or that data. And this will become a more and more important concept as you continue to develop as a software developer, and you start working with bigger and bigger algorithms, bigger and bigger pieces of code, and controlling scope and minimizing basically what your software knows about the other parts of your software becomes very important. And one, for being able to keep everything organized and keep it under control, but also for security, right? Because if you have a piece of your program that knows about everything else in your program, that has to be the most secure part of your program, because if someone can break into that part of your software, then they have access to the rest of your software, which is like where you hear about these famous hacks, right? Like that like the big Target credit card heist was because they had some old out of date software that controlled their HVAC systems, like the industrial blowers in their stores. And someone was able to basically get in through that software and then make it to like Target's data, like payment processing software through that, right? And so that's not good software security. It's not good data security at that point. All right, so that is global scope versus local scope. And then the other concept here in JavaScript, and this will come into play if it's confusing, it's not a big deal at this point, but hoisting is a JavaScript mechanism where variables and function declarations are moved to the top of their scope before code execution, right? And so what's happening is basically everything gets pushed up to the top. So if I come here and I say, sorry. Oops, sorry. That needs to go. So and this is a older, this slide is an older version of, of Replit, but basically you should not be able to access something before it is defined. So you're getting hit with that initialization. But what it's saying is that everything within a scope, so even if you have something at global scope, so I believe if I do let after method equal method, right? So I'm still getting after method because hoisting is basically taking everything at the global scope, and you see it as this, but right at the start of the program, it takes all of the global variables and crams them up to the top like this within their scope. And the same thing in here. So it just basically reorganizes it and crams everything to the top. Like you never see the code visually change, but it's basically moving it within the scope. So, and that's how the compiler keeps everything in order. So that is hoisting. And again, hoisting isn't anything at this level that you really need to concern yourself with, just knowing that it's out there. And it's more important that you keep track of your scope, not that you need to know that that's going to get crammed up there. All right. So, and that is it for the slides today. So now we can start hopping into the challenges. Let's see here.
Can I ask a quick question about scope?
Sure.
If you were to declare a variable as a global variable above a function, when I was trying to do the FizzBuzz, I noticed if I put my variables at top, the function just wouldn't work. I guess, why is that? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Well, so it will work, right? So like I'm calling global name and I'm also calling after method from the global scope into my variable or into my function, right? And depending on what you're trying to do with it, will determine if it'll work or not. So notice, like if I want to, let's say return local name, right? And then I take this and, oops. I do this in console.log, and let me just go ahead and comment these out. All right, so when I run this, I get Nugget, right? That's my local name. Notice how I'm just returning local name out of here. So I'm not actually giving this a parameter, right? And so I could also just return global name out of here. Right? But that's all it's ever going to do is return that global name. Like that's all this function does. It's not dynamic, it's static, it's locked into whatever global name is. And so what happens is, and this is where parameters come into play. So like if let's say that I wanted to pass in Todd, right? Like I should get, like I won't get any type of issue here. But if I were to say param name here, and I'm running it, like now Todd is coming in as a param, but nothing, I'm not doing anything with it. I'm still here. And now the same thing, like if I have a parameter that's required and I don't give it one, oh, I thought it would give me an error. It did not. Probably because I'm not doing anything with it yet. But if I do param name here, right, so it's just giving me undefined because I'm not giving it any type of parameter. But if I do Todd here, right, now I'm returning Todd. And so like you don't always have to return the parameter. You can use a variable in here. Like you could also draw on a global variable and not pass anything in. I mean, there's different ways to do it, but typically what you want to do to make this function as reusable as possible is you want to basically pass that in. And so same thing here, I'm passing a string. I could do as a variable here, like I could pass in global name, right? And now it's global name is going in here as param name, and then it's being spit out as param name. But that's basically like, that's how I would write this. Like I would not write this in a manner that I do not pass a variable or I do not pass a parameter in here and I just access a global variable. That's what we call an anti-pattern. You can do it, but it's not like it's not the best practice, basically. And I see we got a question in there. Is JS compiled or interpreted? I do not know. But I bet somebody's asked Google. So there you go. So again, I'm not sure. Is an interpreted language node performs a just-in-time compilation to machine code the moment the piece of code is executed first. So that's that. Let's see here. Anything else that I can answer with scope? Okay. All right. So
wait a minute. I do have a quick question.
Yep.
Could you touch a little bit further? Like you kind of explained, and I sort of started to grasp why it's best to use local instead of global, but I'm trying to like grasp it a little bit better. So could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. And so basically a local variable is only available inside this function, right? Like the rest of your program, it doesn't matter if you've got one other function or hundreds of other functions, that local variable is only right here, right? And I'm using very you hear my cat trying to break into the cabinet right behind me still. Sorry, one sec. Bro, knock it off. Sorry about that. So where it gets into issues, right, is like if you have so with global variables, you can get your wires crossed really easy, especially if you are in large classes where, again, we're using 20 lines of code and I've got some weird spacing and some comments in here, but when we start writing different classes, which is basically the next layer above a function. So functions keep your blocks of code organized, classes keep your functions organized. And so if you have a class that's maybe 400 or 500 lines long and there's dozens of functions in there, and it basically, if you have a bunch of global variables in there, it becomes very hard to keep track of what needs what. And if you don't need something, you don't want your code to have access to it, right? So like if I write so if I do something like this, so if I do, well, here, I'll leave all this because it's notes. Let's say I do let first equals Charles, oops, come on, let last equals Kubiak. And so now I say, I write a function here. So function full name with, so first and last, and then I say return first space last, right? And so now, like, just to like contrive an example to like make it intentionally difficult, let's say function race results, right? First place, last place, right? And so I come in here and I say, oh, hey, look, I see, maybe I don't see that these are assigned currently, and I just see first and last. Well, I can throw that into race results, right? And see who finished first and who finished last. But then it's just going to spit out Charles Kubiak, right? Because it's not actually going to tell me what I need to know. What would be more reasonable would be that, so I've got that function, and then I've got function like age calc, right? And then I've got function salary calc, right? And so on, and I keep going. Well, none of these need to know what my first and last name are, right? So I don't want these methods to, like, someone comes in and codes in mistake, and next thing you know, like my anonymized salary data is going out with my first and last name stamped on it. And so we just want to be able to control what, like basically what parts of our software have access to different parts of data. And so, and this gets extrapolated out even further when we start talking about, and you don't see it as much in JavaScript, but with other languages, like we have private methods. So basically, once you label a method as, or a function as private, it's not even accessible by the vast majority of the software. It's not accessible anywhere outside of its immediate vicinity. And we do that to basically control access to different parts of the software. So it's just it'll be a concept that we continue to build on.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. And so anything else with scope or anything related to scope? Okay, so then let's go ahead and move on to our first challenge. We can go ahead and do the sum of negatives. Let me go ahead and fork this. All right, so instructions are: write a method which takes in an array of integers and returns the sum of only the negative integers in the array. All right, so let's go ahead and copy these. Some comments in here. All right, so first things first, we've got do our standard questions here. So we've got input or number of inputs is equal to 1, right? The type of input is a array of numbers, and our output is equal to a number. All right, so let's make sure, first step, that we can see what's going on here. All right, so constant.log, so num array. Let's go ahead and run it. Okay, those are my two arrays. So what do I need to do here? Basically, I need to add up all of the negative numbers. So what is the basic building block that we're going to use to check out each element in an array? Anyone want to take a stab at it?
Probably the wrong terminology, but you have to like iterate through the array.
That is the right terminology. So, so we are going to iterate through the array. What basic building block do I use to iterate?
A loop.
A loop, correct. So in this instance, I'm going to do a for loop, right? And so we can say for let I equal 0, I less than num array dot length, and I plus plus, right? And then we can come in here and we can say num array box I. So let's go ahead and console log this now. All right, so now I'm seeing all of my individual elements, right? And so I know that I need to return one output number, right? So I need to return output number. And so I'm going to declare an output number up here, and I'm just going to give it an initial value of 0. So now I could go in here and say output number plus equals num array I. And let's go ahead and wrap these. All right, let's see what we get here. All right, so I got -5 and 10. So not exactly the numbers we were looking for, right? So it looks like we've got -10 plus 5 is my -5, and then 10 is 4 plus 5 plus 1 is 10. So what I'm doing is I'm iterating through and I'm adding every single number in the array. But what I want to do is only add the negative numbers. So how could I check to see if a number is negative or not? What's another?
When is inferior to 0?
Yep, yeah. So the next building block would be control flow. So we could use an if statement, right? So we could say if num array I is less than 0, and we could move this in here, right? And so now we're going to check to make sure that the number is a negative number, and then if it is, we'll add it to 0. All right, so now we've got -10 and 0, so that looks a little bit better. So again, so what I'm stressing here is that notice how I didn't get to the solution right away, right? Like I didn't just jump in and be like, okay, well, I know I'm going to need a loop. Here's my loop. I know I'm going to do like an if statement and so on and so forth. I'm taking it one step at a time, and I'm running my code each time to see if what I think is going to happen each step of the way is actually what's happening, right? Because if I take 3 or 4 steps and I don't get the answer that I'm looking for, I don't know which one of those 3 or 4 steps is the broken one, right? But when I take a step, right, like, so I come in, I console.log to make sure I'm getting it the way I see it. Cool, that's step 1. All right, I know I need a loop, so let's go ahead and write the loop, and let's console.log iterating through my array to make sure that I get each individual number the way I'm expecting it to. Great, once I've done that, let's go ahead, let's define our output number, and then let's basically add all of the numbers in there, regardless of what they are, just to make sure that I'm adding them correctly. Lastly, I can take my control flow and I can start to filter out and only add up the numbers that I make sure that I want to be adding together. All right, so I also talked at the end of the day yesterday about Python Tutor, and so I just want to show this to everyone. Now, this is a great website when you're first starting out and you're trying to visualize what is happening with your code. So it is called pythontutor.com, but you can do Python, Java, C, C++. The big one for us is JavaScript and then also Ruby. So we can do start to visualize your code. I've got JavaScript ES6 picked out here. And so let's go ahead and take this and drop this into Python Tutor and watch what happens. So we'll click visualize execution. Okay, so this code executes in 21 steps. And let me just make this bigger. All right, so on the very first step, the computer comes in and it reads from line 1 down to line 12. And it sees that we have a function called sum of negatives. It saves that function into memory. It knows it's there. It hasn't done anything with it yet. So the next in here, sorry, let me do this. Just take this out of the console. All right. So same thing, comes down here. It sees this. This is our function call. This is what's telling our function to actually kick off, right? So function call happens. With the function call, we give it an array. So we've got num array now has a value of 3, -1, -9, 2. Those are the elements in my array. Output number is still undefined, right? So we execute this line of code. Output number is now defined as 0, and we hit our for loop, right? So for loop comes in, we're looking at it. So I equals 0, right? And then all of this stuff, it loads up everything we need for the for loop. And we hit that first if statement, right? And so we take a look and it says, is array 0, basically, which is 3 less than 0? It is not, so nothing happens down here. We start our loop over into the next part, right? And so now we see that I is 1, right? So I, box 1 is -1. We come down here, we compare it. It is less than 0. So we come in here and we execute this line of code. Now watch output number. After we execute this line of code, output number is now equal to -1, right? We're not done yet. We come back into the loop, right? And so now we're going to check it and it's going to be -9, right? And so we hit this line of code and now output number is -10. Right, we've got one last trip through the loop because I is still not, or is still less than numArray.length, which is 4. Right, so I is now 3. Right, we come in, basically this 2 is not less than 0, so we come back up here. I goes to 4. is no longer meeting the criteria to continue the loop, we come down here, we hit return output number. Output number is -10. Return value from our function is -10, right? And so this step by step shows us exactly how, like, and I can click the button right here and we get -10, but Python Tutor will actually walk us through it step by step. And where this is helpful is if you, let's say you're not looping through correctly or it keeps stopping too soon, you can actually visually see what happens. And it's just a way to help diagnose what's going on with your code. All right, so any questions on how I handled the sum of negatives or how I handled or on Python Tutor? Okay, so next is blackjack. And this one, I am going to break everyone up into groups for this one. And I'll give you probably about 15 minutes to tackle it. Well, probably till 7 o'clock to tackle it. This one is not terrible from basically what we've learned so far. And it's given a number representing the sum of the cards in hand, write a method that returns a string that is the appropriate response in a game of blackjack, i.e. if the sum of the cards in the hand is less than 15, return hit. If the sum is between 15 and 21 inclusive, return stand. And if the sum is greater than 21, return bust. All right, and so looks like we'll probably need to use a little bit of control flow with this one. I'm just going to break everyone out into groups of 3 this time, so smaller groups. And then if there's any issues, we'll come back and we'll talk over the solution to this as a class. And then after that, we'll get into FizzBuzz. And depending on what people want to do with this, either we'll just jump right into it in class, or I'll give you a little bit of time to take a crack at it first. All right. Any questions about blackjack prior to me moving everyone into breakout rooms? And I just dropped the link in the chat. Pause recording here.